You ever hear that story? The one about the single soldier who fought for Japan, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany, all in World War II? It is one of the strangest, most unbelievable tales from the entire war. But the crazy thing is, this viral legend, it actually points to a much bigger and far, far darker truth about millions of soldiers who've been completely forgotten. So let's break this down because the supposed journey of this man, Kyoungjong, is just staggering. It all starts in 1938. He's an 18-year-old Korean living in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, and he gets forced into the Japanese Army. A year later, boom, he's captured by the Soviets. Fast forward to 1943, in the middle of this horrific fighting on the Eastern Front, and he's captured again, but this time by the Germans. And his wild ride finally ends in 1944 when he's captured one last time by American paratroopers on the beaches of Normandy. I mean, just stop and think about that. A Korean man forced to fight for Imperial Japan, then the Soviet Union, then Nazi Germany, only to be found by Americans in France? His journey crosses entire continents, clashing ideologies, and pretty much every major front of the war. You couldn't make this up, right? It sounds way too incredible to be true, and, well, that brings up a really important question. So, is this jaw-dropping story for real? For years, this famous photo of an Asian man in a German uniform was held up as proof. But when historians and journalists really started to dig in, the whole thing, well, it started to fall apart. Yeah, historian Martin K.A. Morgan, he does not mince words. He basically says there's just no proof, no documents, no official records, nothing to suggest Yang ever actually existed. The whole viral story, it seems, is built on a pretty shaky foundation. And here's where you see the real problem. The legend? It's a perfect, clean, unbelievable story. The evidence? It's not really there. A big documentary in South Korea back in 2005 came to the same conclusion. No proof. The man in that photo is still unidentified, and a lot of experts now think he was probably an ethnic Georgian, fighting for the Germans, not a Korean at all. Okay, so Kyoungjong was probably a myth. But here's the thing. That doesn't make his story meaningless. In fact, it's the opposite, because there were Asian men in German uniforms at Normandy. His story, whether it's fact or fiction, is a doorway. It's a gateway to understanding their brutal reality and the truly horrific fate of millions who weren't so lucky. Because the real story here isn't about one man's incredible journey. It's about the systematic, industrialized destruction of millions of Soviet prisoners of war. A crime on a scale that is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Let's just start with the raw numbers, because they are mind-boggling. Over the course of the war, the German army captured about 5.7 million Soviet soldiers. A huge, huge number, most of them taken in those massive battles of 1941. And of those 5.7 million prisoners, an absolutely catastrophic 3 million of them died. They perished in captivity. That is a death rate of over 50%. And let's be crystal clear, this was not an accident. This was not a logistical problem. This was the direct result of a deliberate policy. This chart just lays it all out in stark, horrifying contrast. The death rate for American, British, and other Allied prisoners in German camps was less than 5%, but for Soviet prisoners, an astronomical 57%. They were treated in a fundamentally different way, as if their lives had absolutely no value. So you have to ask why? Why this uniquely cruel treatment? What was going on here? The answer is chilling, and it lies deep in the Nazi ideology that defined the entire war on the Eastern Front. The Nazis had a specific term for it, Vernichtungskrieg, a war of extermination. See, in their minds, this wasn't a normal war between countries. It was a racial and ideological crusade against what they called Jewish Bolshevism. And because of that, they just decided that the Geneva Convention, the international laws of war, simply didn't apply to Soviet soldiers. They stripped them of every single legal protection. And that twisted ideology led directly to what you can only call a policy of murderous neglect. Food wasn't just scarce, it was deliberately withheld. Prisoners were forced on death marches for hundreds of kilometers and shot if they collapsed. Political officers and Jewish soldiers were executed on the spot. Millions were just shoved into open-air fields with no shelter, no sanitation, even in the dead of winter, and just left to die from starvation, disease, and the cold. And if you want to see just how cold and calculated this was, look at this table. This is an official German order from October 1941. It sets the daily ration for a non-working Soviet POW at just under 1,500 calories. That's already way below what a human needs just to survive. And in reality, they often got far, far less than even that. It was, quite literally, a death sentence written down on paper. The result of all this was, it's almost unthinkable. During the winter of 41 to 42, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 Soviet POWs were dying every single month. This was one of the highest, most intense rates of mass death from any atrocity in modern history. So, a crime of this magnitude, second only to the Holocaust in its sheer number of victims? How is it possible that so many of us have never heard this story? Well, the reasons are complicated, and the silence came from both sides of the Iron Curtain. It was really a perfect storm of forgetting. First, back in the Soviet Union, Stalin declared that any soldier who surrendered was a traitor. So the survivors who made it home weren't treated as heroes. They were treated like outcasts, and their stories were buried. Second, in post-war Germany, this powerful myth of a clean Wehrmacht took hold. The idea that the regular army fought honorably, and all the bad stuff was done by the SS. But it was the regular army that was in charge of the POWs. And third, the sheer, unique horror of the Holocaust understandably became the world's primary focus, leaving this other massive atrocity in its shadow. And you can see the real human cost of that silence right here. The few who survived faced a lifetime of struggle. They weren't even recognized as veterans in their own country, in Russia, until 1995. Germany didn't offer any kind of symbolic payment until 2015, 70 years after the war ended. The vast, vast majority died without ever receiving any justice or recognition. And that brings us right back to where we started. The legend of young Kyoungjong is this amazing, memorable story about one individual survivor. But the irony is that this story, by probably being false, has helped to hide the truth about the 3 million who didn't survive. And it leaves us with this really big question to think about. In the huge, messy story of history, why do we hold on so tightly to these simple stories about one person, while the overwhelming, complicated stories of millions are so easily lost?